Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be in Paducah tonight, especially for this very fine library series that you all are blessed to have down here. Um, I'm going to be speaking for right around an hour, and then afterwards I will be more than happy to take all of your questions, and I hope that I can answer them. I'll also have books. So let's get started. 237 miles northeast of Paducah in Shelbyville, Kentucky. There's a bronze historic marker at the corner of 6th and Main Streets. And over the years, that marker has simply become part of the landscape, and people passing by the corner probably don't pay it much attention at all. It marks the site of the old Armstrong Hotel, a Shelbyville landmark, for 85 years, until it burned in 1944. And if you look closer at the sign and you read the script, it says that Brigadier General Henry H. Denhart was slain here on September 20th, 1937. So, how in the world did a brigadier general and a former lieutenant governor end up shot to death in the doorway of the Armstrong Hotel? Well, it's a wild ride. This evening we're looking at the Taylor-Denhart tragedy, an extraordinary story from Kentucky history set in 1936 and 37. That brought national and international attention to Kentucky, and especially to 3 Kentucky counties, Oldham, Henry, and Shelby. How and why LaGrange resident Vernigar Taylor died on the night of November 6, 1936, is one of the most baffling and enduring mysteries in Kentucky history. And I discovered pretty early on that it's a case of secrets within secrets and mysteries within mysteries. Now, on its surface, the Taylor-Denhart case sounds pretty straightforward. It's always been either murder or suicide, but I found out quickly that it's anything but straightforward. I began researching in January 2010, and for 6 years, I followed a very scattered trail of documents. Trial transcripts, court files, letters between the parties, military records, a plethora of newspaper and magazine articles. It was amazing to me how much coverage this case got at the time. Detective magazines that used to be very popular were really into this story too. Early on, I was fortunate to connect with Dr. William Ellis, and some of you may know him. I believe he spoke here several months ago. He wrote an excellent article about the case in 1986 for the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and he very generously allowed me to borrow his research files, which gave me a jump start. Besides digging into dusty and yellowing documents, I interviewed people who remembered the events, or Vernigar Taylor and Henry Denhart. And I interviewed family members, Denhart descendants, as well as members of the Gar and Taylor families. Along the way, I learned firsthand how a violent crime can affect a family for generations. Long after the event, and long after the person, the victim, is deceased. Along the way, I also recognized that many of the issues raised by the story are still part of our lives today. Gun violence, the treatment of the wealthy and powerful in our legal system, jury nullification, the failure of the legal system to address wrongs, and domestic violence. The most frequently asked question I receive is how in the world I got started on this story and became obsessed enough to dedicate 6 years of my life to it. Well, back in 2007, I just happened to pick up a local magazine called Shelby County Life. I live in Shelby County, and this was the September issue. And I remember the front cover had vintage photographs, and it had, I'm really struggling with this, but I'll keep going. It had vintage photographs, and there were blood splotches on the cover. Well, I couldn't resist that. When I opened it up, it really was Pandora's box. It was quite a fascinating story. Denhart, a state politician and military man, was accused of shooting his fiancée, a beautiful businesswoman from LaGrange named Vernigar Taylor, on the cold night of Friday, November 6, 1936. He claimed she committed suicide, but the authorities thought differently. And the article commemorated the 70th, at that time, anniversary of Denhart's slaying in Shelbyville, which was quite a sensational county and city event. Now, at the time, I didn't have the urge to research it any further. I thought it was a fascinating case, but I just kind of laid it aside. But I must have stored it away in my mind, because if you fast forward about 2.5 years, we had another state politician who was accused of murdering his ex-fiancée. They say there's nothing new under the sun. It must have been those headlines in late 2009 that brought back this story to me. And in January 2010, it just hit me like a thunderbolt. I remembered this story, and with it was an overwhelming urge to find out more about it. Now, I didn't set out to write a book. I've become a believer that sometimes a writer chooses a topic, decides to write about it, but sometimes the subject chooses the writer. I'm not sure how that happens, but I think that's what happened to me. I started researching in January 2010, and I really couldn't stop. I was really hooked on the story. Early on in my research, I became convinced that the murder case against General Denhart just could not have happened the way history had led us to believe. So I kept researching and writing, and my notes became chapters, and the chapters evolved into the 3 sections of the book. And after 6 years and 4.5 revisions, I had a book. I started with a blank slate, and I made no assumptions. I'm not related to the Gars, the Taylors, or the Denharts. I did not assume that Denhart was the murderer, and I did not assume that Taylor didn't commit suicide. I set out to learn as much as I could about these two, determined to keep an open mind. In retrospect, I'm very glad I did it that way. It allowed me to get to know both of them without having an agenda. If I had said, here's the murderer, now let me see if I can fit this together, I don't think I would have uncovered near as much as I did. Dark Highway took 6 years of research and writing. I would work during the day, put my daughter to bed around 10 o'clock at night, and then write until 1 or 2 in the morning, quite often. I like to say that a lot of Dark Highway was written around the witching hour. Luckily, I prefer to write at night. I have friends who get up early and start writing at 4 or 5 in the morning, and the thought of that is so painful to me. There's no way. I don't think my brain really kicks into gear to start writing until around 10 o'clock. Most of my weekends were spent either writing or researching, and living in Shelby County was very helpful because I was close to the epicenters of this case. Newcastle over in Henry County, LaGrange over in Oldham County, and of course Shelbyville. I lived in Shelby County. Some writers will lay their work aside for inspiration for a week or a month and then come back. I never needed to be inspired. I never left the story, and it haunted me. The story never left me. A laptop followed me along on vacations. And I can look at chapters and say, oh, I was in Miami when I wrote that opening, or I was in the mountains when I started that chapter. Last July, 2 days after the book was released, I spoke at a writers' conference in Louisville about writing and researching true crime. The first question I asked the group, I just couldn't resist it, was how many of you all have ever heard of Brigadier General Henry H. DAngelo? And they all just sat and looked at me. No one raised their hands. I didn't even bother to ask about Vernigar Taylor. But if we had been alive in the 20s and the 30s, we would readily know who General DAngelo was. DAngelo is a figure from Kentucky history that has largely been forgotten, undoubtedly because of the last disastrous year of his life. Henry Herman DAngelo was born in Bowling Green in 1876. And I've gotten to know him pretty well, and I can tell you he is quite an interesting and complex character. During his lifetime, he was an attorney. He was a 2-term Warren County judge. He was a decorated World War I hero. He was a lieutenant governor in the 20s, and he actually ran for governor 2 times. From 1931 to 35, he was state adjutant general, and he was also a brigadier general in the Kentucky National Guard. But on November 6, 1936, he took on the title that he would always be remembered by, if he's remembered at all, alleged murderer. Of course, in 1936 and 37, DAngelo was never the alleged murderer. He was always just considered the murderer of his fiancée. Now, DAngle's last official position in state government was adjutant general. And when A.B. Happy Chandler was elected, DAngelo knew that his time in state government was over. The 2 men had been at political odds in the past, and DAngelo left Frankfort at the end of the Laffoon administration. He packed up his office in January 1936, and in the past he had always moved home to Bowling Green between stints. But this time he retired to Oldham County. In 35, he bought quite a large farm. It was 800 acres, and there was a large house on the back of it, about half a mile off the road. And this picture was taken in 1936, right after Vernigar Taylor died. Reporters were swarming over his property, trying to get pictures of him. You can see that this is an AP wire photo, so this went national. But take a look at the tree, because I'm going to show you what this house looks like in 2014. Notice that at this time you got a whole house and you got a small tree in front. And that's what it looks like today. It is in pretty bad shape, but I was able to go inside it. The owner of the property allowed us to go back and make photographs. And I actually went upstairs in it. Now, I can tell you this is in a very desolate spot on the back of the property. And in the records, it talks about the house being half a mile off the road. Well, it is. It's an old farm road to get to it. I like to say that if DAngelo had moved home to Warren County, I wouldn't be standing here with a book tonight. But within 6 months, he met Vernigar Taylor, and the die was cast. Verna Taylor was not just an attractive woman, she was an intelligent and competent businesswoman. I'd also characterize her as strong and resilient. Her husband had died in 1931, leaving her the family's laundry business called the Community Laundry in LaGrange. And it was, of course, at the worst possible time in U.S. economic history. And for the next 5 years, she worked tirelessly to make the business a success and to keep the employees working during the worst years of the Depression. And I'd say she was a success. On the night she died, she had $3,500 in the bank and no debts. And I am hoping that something of her will rub off on me, perhaps, since I wrote the book. Verna was the sole support of her household. She had 2 teenage daughters. And she was very active in the LaGrange Methodist Church. I like to say that if the doors to the church were open, Verna was in there. She served on a number of committees, and she was a Sunday school teacher. In short, she was one of the most respectable people in LaGrange, male or female. Now, on the day these two met in early June 1936, he was an aging 60, and she was a vivacious 40. Sometimes I wonder if the Earth didn't shift on its axis in a sinister way, or 2 planets didn't nearly collide on the day they met. The relationship that very innocently developed from dinners, movies, and drives in the countryside is the very definition of an ill-fated romance. The Oldham Era, in one of its many articles about the case, once referred to it as a blood-stained romance. I wouldn't argue with that. Within 14 months of that initial meeting, both had died violently. One out on what is now Highway 146 in Henry County, and the other almost right in the middle of downtown Shelbyville. Ultimately, they are the only 2 people who really know the truth. I chose to begin Dark Highway with that fateful night of Friday, November 6th, when a telephone call comes into the funeral home in LaGrange. Now, the week of November 6th had already been quite newsworthy. There was a presidential election on Tuesday, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was reelected by a landslide over Alf Landon. Then sometime before dawn, there was a huge snowstorm, quite unusual for early November in Kentucky. The newspapers referred to it as a blizzard. The snow blanketed Kentucky from Paducah all the way up through the state to Cincinnati, where the conditions were so bad that the zoo closed for the first time in 60 years. Power was out, trees and limbs covered the highways, and electricity was out in areas where it was available. And crews worked long hours, and by Friday, the roads were cleaned up and things had pretty much returned to normal in LaGrange. That is, until a telephone call came into the funeral home on Friday night. Now, funeral director Smith Kitely was on duty that evening, and he remembered that the call came in very close to 10. I saw a statement that Kitely had given to investigators, and he remembered the time because his favorite radio show came on at 10 o'clock, and he had just sat down in his favorite chair to listen to it. And we all know how that is. We settle down, we're ready to relax, and the phone or something, rings, or someone comes to the door. In writing this scene, I was struck by how quickly the course of our lives can change by something as innocent as the ringing of a telephone. Now, Kitely assumed this was an ordinary death call, but this particular call from local barber J.B. Hunley was about to change his life and the lives of many other people forever. Hundley said he had been sent to fetch Kitely out to a scene on the highway near George and Nettie Baker's farm, where a woman had been shot and her body was in the ditch or old road bed just beyond the boundary of their farm. Hundley knew her, and he said, "It's Verna Garr Taylor." People were absolutely stunned. With all the horrible things we hear daily, it's hard to convey just how stunned and appalled people were by the death of one of Oldham County's most respectable women. And it's hard to describe how shocking and big an event this was. But I can tell you that people in their 90s could tell me exactly where they were when they heard the news of her death. I had one lady tell me that she had been to a Bible contest in Lawrenceburg, and when she got back on Saturday morning, her mother ran down the driveway to meet her at the car and tell her what had happened. Another lady told me that her mother woke her up in the middle of the night to tell her what had happened. If friends, acquaintances, and people who lived in the area were shocked, it's hard to imagine the profound effect this would have had on Verna's two daughters. Now, when Kitely arrived out at the scene, the general was present, and he immediately claimed it's suicide. She committed suicide. He told a strange story. He said the two had been on a day trip to Louisville, and this was not unusual for Verna to go to Louisville on Fridays to do her banking and to check her laundry's account at the Kentucky Military Institute. But during the day, Denhart said she became increasingly despondent and depressed. And on the way home that evening, she was driving. She drove through LaGrange, past the street that led to her house. And that's a mystery today. No one knows. I have some ideas perhaps why, but no one really knows why she drove past the safety of her street on into Henry County. When she went to turn the car around, it stalled with a dead battery. The car was pushed to George Baker's driveway by Baker and by J.B. Hundley, and the couple stayed in the car. Now, Denhart said that he walked to the side porch. You all can see the side porch. It's still there in this photograph, to ask about a telephone. And when he came back to the car, he said that Verna was gone, and there was a loud gunshot from up the road. He said that she had taken his gun, walked up the road, and shot herself. The story grew legs very quickly. Today we would say that it went viral. It made its first appearance in the New York Times scarcely 2 days after Verna died. She died on the night of November 6th, and it was in the New York Times on Sunday, November the 8th. Over the next year, the story was carried in newspapers around the nation and even internationally. I found an article in an Australian newspaper, and the London Herald carried stories. There were articles and pictures in Life, Newsweek, and Time magazines. The story shared the front pages with some of the biggest national stories of the time. The abdication of Edward VIII and his marriage to Wallis Simpson, the Hindenburg disaster, and the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. A few weeks ago, I was glued to the History Channel, like so many other people, to see the special on Amelia Earhart that received so much publicity. And at one point, a front page of a newspaper called the Evening Sun flashed on the screen. And right beside the Earhart headline was a General Denhart headline. And I nearly fell off the couch. This story absolutely fascinated and mesmerized people at the time, and it had a widespread appeal. I think it's because it's, of course, very much a Kentucky tale. It's part of us. But the setting could really be anywhere. You could put this in Connecticut or Pennsylvania, and I guess you would just have to change the accents. But it would fit in there too. I can only say that it grabbed me just as hard in 2010 as it did the people in the 30s. Now, an autopsy was performed, and it was 5 days after Verna had been buried. She was exhumed and autopsied. At the time she was buried, they did not know whether she died from one shot or 2 shots. They confirmed in the autopsy that it was 1 shot, and it was through the heart at a very odd angle. It was traveling from here, right about the left breast, and it exited on the right 2 inches higher, and it went through the heart on the way. She would have been, if she shot herself, she would have been in a very cramped position like this. The autopsy concluded it was not a suicide. Thanks to the Kentucky Historical Society and the Kentucky Military History Museum, my photographer was able to make photos of the same make and model gun. This is a Smith & Wesson .45 caliber U.S. Army model 1917. It's an officer's weapon. And it's in the hands of a woman who's the identical height, weight, and who has the same arm length as Verna Garr Taylor. Now, Verna was 5'8", 145 pounds. She was very tall and slender. And she had an arm length from the shoulder to the fingertips of 26 inches. And while there's no way to know for certain the size of her hands, I hope that by finding a model who had the exact dimensions, the hands might be a good estimate. I wanted the reader to see how large this gun is, and I can tell you it's very heavy. I handled it, pointed it, and it's not an easy weapon for a woman to handle. Now, Denhart quickly knew that he was in trouble and that he was going to need an attorney or attorneys to represent him. The authorities were not going to accept his version of Verna's suicide. And as might be expected, Denhart had some outstanding lawyers on his team. They were John Marshall Berry of Newcastle, father of Wendell Berry, by the way, and that's him on the far left. Clark Oddie of Louisville, who is in the back middle. Rhodes Myers, Denhart's 25-year friend and state representative, is the dark-haired man in the foreground. And of course, you recognize General Denhart on the far right there. They really don't look too unhappy, even though they're in court. Myers was a renowned orator and had won prizes in law school for his speaking ability. Oddie was a well-known crack defense attorney. And Berry was a solid and excellent lawyer who was familiar with Henry County Circuit Court practice and courtroom etiquette in front of Judge Charles Marshall, who would hear this case. For a while, Denhart was also represented by a man named Beckham Overstreet. Overstreet was on the case for several months, and he made the mistake of asking to be paid. And the general refused. He said, "You're just a volunteer." And he refused to pay him. And I guess there were words, and the two didn't get along, and Overstreet insisted on being paid, and finally he resigned when he said Denhart threatened to kill him. I think I would resign too. Denhart tried the patience of his attorneys daily. He spoke to the press against their advice. He wrote pages of to-do memorandums. I've got some of them. He questioned their ability to defend him, their strategies, and at times even their loyalty. It is an understatement to say that the general was every attorney's nightmare client. The general was indicted for murder by the Henry County Grand Jury in January 1937. And his trial was set for January. It was going to be speedy justice. That seems pretty incredible now, doesn't it? But if January 1937 sounds a little ominous to you historians out there, it should. While the grand jury was listening to the witnesses in Newcastle, a monumental weather event was underway as the Ohio River began its march inland. The Great Flood, or the 37 flood, delayed the start of Denhart's trial and allowed his attorneys the extra time they needed to prepare their very difficult client for the fight of his life. It was April 19th before the trial finally began. And the scene in Newcastle was beyond chaotic. On the courthouse lawn, which was normally very sedate and quiet, there were musicians singing, there were booths selling sandwiches and drinks, and there was even a snake charmer performing for the crowd. Now, I've been to a number of legal events in Kentucky, and I have never seen a snake charmer performing. But I think perhaps we should talk to the Kentucky Bar Association and see if we can work one out for the convention. Newsweek magazine wrote, "Newcastle, Kentucky made holiday. Farmers left plows and soil, hot and fragrant with spring. Mothers brought babies at the breast. Everybody came to ogle a former lieutenant governor accused of murdering his sweetheart." Well, the farmers did come to town and add to the chaos because it rained nearly every day of the trial. The Denhart murder trial was unlike anything really seen in Kentucky up to that time. There was both national and international coverage. There were out-of-state experts in ballistics, chemistry, pathology, blood splatter, and blood typing. Today, we are very familiar with the practice of using paid out-of-state experts, the dueling expert system. But in 1937, this was relatively new territory, especially in rural Kentucky. The trial also featured a modern marvel called a sparkograph machine that was capable of photographing a bullet and the accompanying gases released when a weapon was fired. This was important to prove that the weapon released gases, so you would have a valid paraffin test. The newspapers came to call the trial a laboratory trial. Denhart's murder trial was also an excellent example of a trial as public entertainment, something that we have become very familiar with today. It was ahead of its time, but it was also a good example of Kentucky justice in 1937. At one point, a hog's carcass was rolled into court for a ballistics demonstration. The victim's bloody clothes were displayed, held up piece by piece for the jury to see and for everyone in the courtroom to see and for Verna's two daughters to see who sat through this trial. And I don't know how they did it, but they did. Pieces of skin cut from around the victim's wounds were displayed in a jar of preservative solution and entered as evidence. It was a rough, rough trial. And 30-year jurist Charles Marshall really had his hands full. He threatened to empty the courtroom several times. And if you read the book, you'll probably pick up on the fact that Judge Charles Marshall is one of my favorite characters. The newspapers reported that there were 1,200 to 1,500 people in the courtroom daily. There were people sitting in the windowsills, leaning against the radiators, just anywhere they could prop themselves. And if there was no place to sit, then they stood. There was standing room only, and people fainted in the press of humanity. And if you had a seat and you didn't want to lose it, you would haul your lunch up 2 stories from the courthouse lawn below. The spectacle lasted for 2 weeks. And on May the 5th, the jury came in without a decision. They couldn't decide Denhart's guilt or innocence. This was absolutely shocking. On April 19th, the only questions were whether he might get the death penalty or how long he would go to jail. In fairness, Denhart had already been tried and convicted in public opinion and in the press before he ever took his seat at the defense table on April the 19th. Now, Denhart had sparred with the press in the past. While he was president of the state senate in 1926, he directed the sergeant of arms to admit all reputable reporters, but instructed them not to admit a Courier-Journal reporter named Donald McSwain. And he didn't stop there. He gave a long-winded, heavy-handed speech condemning the reporter and pretty much ruining his reputation, calling him dishonest, crooked, and unfair. During his speech, Denhart happened to mention that the reporter had written articles about him that were not very complimentary. So that was probably the root of his problem with the reporter. It's unwise for a politician to make an enemy of the press because it can come back to haunt. And in 1936 and 37, it was open season on General Denhart, who immediately became the villain in the press. Newspaper articles during the trial were filled with negative and really insulting comments. I was amazed at some of the things I read in the articles. One Louisville reporter wrote, "He is a bulbous man, General Denhart. The stocky type become padded and somewhat saggy from the flesh pots. His once square jaws are now loose flaps of skin over soft flesh. His eyes are so pale as to be scarcely discernible, even at a short distance. The Denhart ears are out of proportion. They are small, almost lobeless, womanish." Never make an enemy of the press. So with all of this, when the jury was unable to reach a decision, it was absolutely astounding. And the rumor spread, of course, that the jury had been bribed. Now, I still run into people in Oldham and Henry counties that claim the jury was bribed. And when I ask them, well, who was bribed in particular? Just give me some information and I'll get on the trail of it. Nobody can tell me which juror was bribed and how it happened. My thoughts on that is that the general was so frugal, he didn't even pay his attorneys. I wouldn't think he would be bribing the jury. I really think that the evidence was way beyond the education level of the jury pool. Now, I have a lot more education than the men on that jury, and I can tell you I've read the trial transcript a number of times, and I have to reread that expert witness testimony because it's very confusing. And I'm sure these very practical men wondered how a chemical solution or a multi-base nitrocellulose, nitroglycerin gunpowder related to whether Denhart pulled the trigger or Verna pulled the trigger. And worst of all, and something I found most troubling, was that no one had a believable explanation for how she died. And no one ever did. Prosecutor H.B. Kinsolving was not to be outdone, and a second trial was scheduled for September 21st, and Denhart went home to Bowling Green for the summer. He didn't bother to go to his Oldham County farm. It was no longer safe for him to stay in Oldham County. There had been talk of vigilante justice. So the general went home to Bowling Green. And he spent a lot of time quibbling with his attorneys over how much he was willing to pay them for saving his life. And letters flew back and forth between Denhart and Bowling Green and Barry and Newcastle. And then in early July, another front opened in the Denhart saga. He was accused of murdering another woman, Patricia Wilson, at the Sealback Hotel in Louisville in July 1936. Now, he was seeing Verna Taylor at this time, but she had been on vacation with her youngest daughter in New York. And I do not believe she was back in town on the night this woman died. In a wrongful death suit, a civil suit, filed by the family of Patricia Wilson, Denhart was accused of assaulting and beating Wilson, causing her to fall to her death in an elevator shaft of the hotel. Now, what's interesting to me is that the civil wrongful death suit was filed, but a criminal case against him wasn't. Generally, not always, but generally, the civil case will arise out of the criminal case. And the classic instance of this is the O.J. Simpson case. And O.J. Simpson was acquitted, and then the families filed the civil wrongful death suit for monetary damages. Now, Denhart had been expecting a wrongful death suit from the Gars and the Taylors, but that never materialized. This one took him completely by surprise. My thoughts on this whole episode are that that case was not, the Patricia Wilson case was not well investigated. The newspapers immediately identified her as what they called a party girl, a polite 1930s term for a prostitute. She was one of the women attracted to the wealthy and the powerful men who gathered at the Sealback Hotel in downtown Louisville. And Denhart admitted that was one of his watering holes, but he denied being there that night. But I do believe that if there had been real evidence of his guilt, they would have filed a criminal case because he was very vulnerable during that last year of his life. So this case, the Wilson case, was still in the legal system as his September trial date approached for his second trial. Throughout the summer, the general insisted he wouldn't be tried again. As late as mid-August, on maneuvers at Fort Knox, Denhart told the New York Times, "I don't think they'll hold another trial in September. They don't have enough evidence." "I didn't do it," he added for good measure. I found no evidence in my research that the general was psychic, but he was spot on when he said he wouldn't be tried again. On the morning of September 20th, Denhart left Bowling Green for the last time in the company of his attorney, Rhodes Myers. And the two traveled from Bowling Green to Shelbyville, and that afternoon they checked into the Armstrong Hotel. Now, Louisville would have been the safer and less obvious place to stay, but they thought they were outside the hotbeds of Oldham and Henry counties, and they would be safe in Shelbyville. And they were due in Newcastle the next morning for court, so it was closer. Well, it was a fateful decision. That evening, Denhart came face to face with Verna's brothers at the corner of 6th and Main, and he died in a desperate, zigzagging military run to reach the doorway of the hotel. I've had someone tell me if that door had pushed open, he might have made it, but he had to stop and try to pull the door open, and he died in the doorway. Edward Garr, who is the middle brother here, called Doc because he was a veterinarian. The newspapers referred to him as the frail veterinarian because he suffered from what is probably PTSD. Roy Garr, who is on your right, and Jack, the youngest brother, were all jailed in Shelby County. Jack did not have a weapon that night, but neither did General Denhart. He didn't have a gun on him. All shots were to the back. He was hit twice in the back and once in the back of the head. There's a song from late 1937 that was very popular at the time, and it begins like this. The harvest moon was shining on the streets of Shelbyville on the night that General Denhart met his fate. The Garr boys was a-waitin', they was out to shoot to kill. Death and General Denhart had a date. Well, he did have a date with death, and the question is whether it was an intentional date. The song makes it sound intentional, and the newspapers immediately assumed that it was. The British newspapers called Denhart's death at the hands of the brothers an honor slang. No one condemned them. Even the newspaper articles that assumed the brothers had laid a death trap and intentionally killed him did not condemn them. The one exception was the Bowling Green Times-Journal, because that paper was owned by the Denharts. And the headline read, "Cold-blooded murder," but it was the only newspaper that was sympathetic at all. Most people simply believed that Denhart got what he deserved. I spoke with a very elderly member of the Denhart family years ago, 2012, I think. She died a couple of years ago at 96. She was very sharp, and she remembered General Denhart because she had married his nephew. And she remembered him coming to family events and how he was a very large man. But I'll never forget what she said to me. I don't know about his guilt or innocence, but I always thought it was a shame the way he died. Truly, for Denhart, it was a disgraceful end to what had once been a distinguished, but sometimes controversial life. Now, the brothers had more than one motive to kill him, but they all swore under oath that they didn't know he was in Shelbyville. They didn't intend to murder him. He made a motion of reaching for his back pocket with his right hand as he ran. He actually did have a habit of doing that, and he was shot in Bowling Green in 1931 when he made the identical gesture. When Roy surrendered his gun to the policeman, he said that Denhart went for his gun, but he beat him to it. Now, I've stood on the corner of 6th and Main on a September 20th years ago. By this time, you all probably know that I'm crazy enough to do that. And my objective was to see the lighting as it is today. And there wasn't a large harvest moon that night. And the lighting today is improved, of course, but it's still shadowy. And I would assume that with a large harvest moon, that it might cast more shadows on those very tall, 3-story brick buildings up and down Main Street. And the lighting then would have been much worse, probably, than what I saw. And so if you were scared to death of somebody, and let me say that all of these parties were scared of one another. Denhart was as afraid of the Garr brothers as the Garr brothers were of him. Then you might think you saw someone pulling a gun as they ran. The brothers were very convincing, and their stories all matched. I've had a family member, Doc's grandson actually, tell me that he thought it would be far out of character for these guys to have done it intentionally. And from what I know of them in my research, I would agree with that. My position in writing part 3 of Dark Highway is that without definite proof otherwise, that isn't just hearsay, great-grandmother always said, grandfather said, my family always heard, that it would be wrong of me 80 years later to say these guys perjured themselves. So, who knows? Maybe it just was fate in that large harvest moon. Now, the Shelbyville trial was as well attended and as sensational as the one in Newcastle. Businesses in LaGrange actually closed so people could come to Shelbyville and support the Garr brothers. That gives you an idea of how well-liked and popular this family was in Oldham County. Movie director D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, also showed up at the trial on at least one day. Now, D.W. Griffith was much more popular then, as was his movie, than it is now, but it caused a sensation. He has had a house. He had retired to Oldham County, and he had a house that was on the same street as Verna's house, and it's still there today. I'd say it's about 5 houses up from hers. Also there was a young man who was destined for greatness in the Kentucky legal system. This is a picture of a law school class that came to see a trial in action. They came to watch the Garr brothers. And Chief Justice John Palmore is the young man in the back, and you can see just the top of his head kind of peeping over. Years ago, I had the privilege to talk with Justice Palmore, judge. And he loved talking about the day he came to Shelbyville with his law school class to see the Garr brothers on trial. It was a good memory of his. So in Shelbyville, I found it interesting that the victim and his character were on trial. I actually thought it was the trial Denhart should have received in Newcastle. He was described by witness after witness as violent, power drunk, threatening. Someone called him a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And a number of witnesses testified that he always had a gun on him. It didn't seem to matter that he didn't have a gun on him the night he died. Ballard Clark, one of the attorneys for the defense, said in his summation, "I say to you that you have a right to shoot a mad dog if it attacks you. The fact that he turns his back to you makes no difference." Well, the jury thought so too. Roy was acquitted, and the case against Jack was dismissed because he was unarmed on the night that Denhart died. Doc appeared at the examining trial, and I was able to go through and get his testimony. But by the time of the murder trial, he was under a doctor's care for mental issues. John Hershenroeder a Courier Journal reporter who covered the Denhard case and the Garr brothers trial, said that a platoon of Marines could not have forced that jury to convict Roy Garr. It was a classic example of jury nullification. He also noted the puzzled expressions on the faces of out-of-town reporters when rebel yells went up in the courtroom when Roy was acquitted. They had never heard a rebel yell, and they didn't know what was going on. The case against Doc was actually dismissed in February of 1938. The prosecutor wisely said that if he could not convict Roy, there was no way that he would be able to convict Doc. Now, Doc had suffered from what the doctors at the time called a nervous condition, shell shock. It was undoubtedly PTSD, and he must have had quite a case of it. Since his service in World War I, he had been in and out of veterans' hospitals. But after the trial and after Doc's case was dismissed, things settled down. I assume that people became more concerned with the war drums coming from Europe than resurrecting and looking at this case again. After all, the bad guy had gotten his due. It was over. But then in late 1938, the case flashed into the headlines one last time when Doc gave a statement to a Louisville reporter that was published in the Louisville Times. Now, he claimed that Denhart was involved in Verna's death, but that the general didn't kill her. There was at least one accomplice, and he actually wrote a letter to Frankfurt to try to get them to reopen the case. He said in the article, "I'll see to it that the truth about Verna's death is known if I die for it. And when the real story breaks, it will blow the top off the courthouse." But a month and 18 days later, he was dead from peritonitis after surgery for an ulcerated stomach. In her article after the interview with Doc, reporter Jane Dixon wrote, "The character of the evidence Dr. Garr believes establishes the motive for the grisly tragedy on the dark highway is such as cannot be discussed in public print." Another mystery. But that is the Taylor Denhart case. It's secrets within secrets and mysteries within mysteries. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. You've been a great group. I want to thank the evenings upstairs at the library for having me here tonight. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to meeting you all afterwards, signing some books. And one of the great things about writing a book is that you get to meet people. So I look forward to meeting you all. Thank you very much.